The rain poured down in steady streams against the towering glass windows of the high-rise office, the city below flickering with a sea of red and white lights. Inside, the atmosphere was colder than the storm outside. He sat at his desk, fingers tapping against the polished surface, his expression unreadable. The room was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the fireplace in the corner, but even its warmth couldn't thaw the ice that had settled within him long ago. Everyone in the company feared him. His reputation wasn't just for show. He had built his empire from the ground up, cutting through competition with ruthless precision. He didn't believe in second chances. He didn't believe in emotions clouding judgment. And most of all, he didn't believe in love. His assistant stood across from him, clutching a folder, careful not to make eye contact. "Sir, there's someone here for the interview," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "If they're not qualified, send them away." The assistant hesitated. She insisted. His brow furrowed slightly at the unusual response. He never entertained anyone who defied the rules, yet something in the way his assistant shifted nervously caught his attention. With a sigh, he finally glanced at her. "Send her in." The door opened, and she walked in with quiet confidence. No hesitation. No fear. She wasn't like the others who stumbled over their words in his presence, or shrank under his cold gaze. She met his eyes directly, a quiet fire burning in them. She wasn't dressed like someone who was desperate for a job, nor did she look like someone who needed his approval. There was something disarming about her, something he couldn't quite place. "You're not what I expected," he said, breaking the silence. She tilted her head slightly. "Neither are you." He arched a brow. "Is that so?" She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people gave him out of politeness or fear. It was different, as if she already knew something he didn't. "I've heard the stories about you," she continued, placing her arsum on his desk. "Cold, ruthless, heartless. But I don't think that's the whole story." His fingers paused against the desk. "And what makes you think you know anything about me?" She shrugged. "Because no one is truly heartless." For the first time in years, he found himself speechless. People had called him many things, most of them true. But this? No one had ever dared to look past the surface. No one had ever questioned if there was more beneath the icy exterior he had carefully built. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound filling the room as an unsettling silence stretched between them. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You think you can prove that?" Her expression didn't falter. "I don't need to." "You will." Something flickered in his chest, something unfamiliar and unwelcome. He had spent years ensuring nothing could get through, yet here she was standing in front of him, as if she had already seen the cracks. He didn't believe in love. He didn't believe in kindness without an agenda. And he certainly didn't believe that someone like her could change anything about him. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't so sure. That moment lingered between them, heavy with something unspoken. He was used to people walking on eggshells around him, choosing their words carefully to avoid his wrath. But she stood there, as if she had nothing to lose, as if she wasn't the least bit intimidated by the weight of his reputation. It was both frustrating and intriguing. He picked up her arsum, flipping through it with a calculated expression. Her qualifications were impressive, far beyond what was required for the position. Yet she was applying for a job she was clearly overqualified for. That didn't sit right with him. People didn't just walk into his world without an agenda. "What do you really want?" he asked, setting the papers down and meeting her gaze again. Her lips curved slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "A job." His eyes narrowed. "You could get a job anywhere." She tilted her head slightly. "Then why do you think I'm here?" That was exactly what he wanted to know. For a long moment, he just studied her. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about her was different. People didn't challenge him unless they were foolish or reckless, and she didn't seem to be either. It was almost as if she had come here knowing exactly what kind of person he was, but she wasn't afraid of it. "Fine," he finally said. "You're hired." Most people would have reacted with relief or excitement, but she didn't. She just nodded, as if she had expected this outcome all along. That only made him more suspicious. "Report to my assistant tomorrow," he added. "She'll show you the ropes." She gave another slight nod before turning toward the door. Then, just as she reached for the handle, she paused. "You say you don't believe in love," she said, without looking back. "I wonder if that's because you've never really felt it, or because you're afraid to." His fingers tightened slightly against the desk, but before he could respond, she was gone. The room felt different after she left, almost too quiet. He exhaled, shaking his head. He had met many people in his life, but she was unlike any of them. And that made her dangerous. By the time the next morning arrived, he had almost convinced himself that he had overanalyzed the entire interaction. But the moment she walked into the office, all those thoughts came rushing back. She moved with quiet confidence, not like someone who was trying to prove anything, but like someone who had already figured things out. His assistant gave her a brief rundown of the office structure, but he could tell she wasn't really paying attention to the rules. She was observing, learning. He didn't like it. The first week passed, and she was efficient, almost too efficient. She learned quickly, adapted faster than anyone he had ever hired. But more than that, she paid attention to things no one else did. It wasn't just the way she handled her work, it was the way she handled people. Employees who had spent years fearing him suddenly seemed more at ease when she was around. His assistant, who rarely spoke more than necessary, actually smiled once. Even the usually hostile board members seemed to soften when she was in the room. It irritated him. Not because she was doing anything wrong, but because it felt like she was undoing something he had built for years. He had spent so much time making sure people respected him through fear. He had kept his world cold and calculated, because that was the only way to survive. And then she walked in and changed the temperature without even trying. One afternoon, he called her into his office. She entered without hesitation, standing in front of his desk, as if she already knew he had been watching her. "Tell me," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what exactly is your goal here?" She raised an eyebrow. "My goal? You're not like the others," he said plainly. "You're too smart to be wasting your time in this position. So why are you here?" For the first time, she hesitated. It was only for a fraction of a second, but he caught it. "I told you," she finally said. "I needed a job." He didn't believe that for a second, but instead of pressing, he watched her carefully. "You think I'm a heartless man?" Her expression didn't change. "That's what people say. And what do you think?" She studied him for a moment before answering. "I think people aren't always what they seem." His jaw tightened slightly. He should have been annoyed by her evasiveness, but instead he found himself even more curious. Weeks passed, and their interactions became a strange game. She never cowered under his sharp words, never flinched when he tested her patience. Instead, she held her ground in a way no one else ever had. But what bothered him most was how, little by little, she was slipping into the spaces he had spent years keeping empty. One evening, long after most employees had left, he found himself standing near the office windows, staring out at the city. He wasn't sure why he was still there so late. Or rather, he did know. He just didn't want to admit it. A soft voice broke the silence behind him. "Still working?" He turned slightly to see her leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back out at the skyline. "You ask a lot of questions." She smiled slightly. "Maybe because you never give real answers." He let out a slow breath. "And why do you care?" She stepped forward. "Because I don't think you're as cold as you want people to believe." His grip on the glass tightened. "You think you know me. I think you don't even know yourself." Her words hit harder than he expected. He had spent years believing he was in control of everything: his company, his life, his emotions. But the way she looked at him made him wonder if she saw something even he had ignored. He turned to face her fully. "You should be careful," he said, his voice lower. "Getting too close to someone like me isn't a good idea." She met his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe you should be careful too." The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken. He had never felt anything like this before. For years, he had convinced himself that love was nothing more than a distraction, an illusion people clung to because they were afraid of being alone. But now he wasn't so sure, and that terrified him. Over the following weeks, their interactions became something neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just the subtle glances across the office, or the way their conversations always seemed to tread the fine line between confrontation and something deeper. It was the fact that she was unraveling him piece by piece, without even trying. He was a man who controlled everything: his business, his reputation, the way people saw him. But with her, that control felt fragile. It frustrated him, made him wary. And yet, he couldn't stop himself from being drawn in. One evening, long after the office had emptied, he found her sitting at her desk, completely immersed in something on her screen. She didn't notice him at first, and for a moment, he just stood there watching. She wasn't like anyone else in his company. She didn't seek his approval or try to impress him. She just existed in his world, unaffected by the weight of his name. "You should go home," he finally said, breaking the silence. She looked up, surprised to see him still there. "I could say the same to you." He smirked slightly. "I live here, remember?" Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she closed her laptop and stood up. "Then maybe that's the problem." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if debating whether to say what was really on her mind. Then, in that same calm, steady voice that always managed to catch him off guard, she said, "You don't know how to exist outside of this office." He let out a short laugh, but it lacked amusement. "And you do?" She tilted her head slightly. "I know how to live." "Do you?" That question stayed with him long after she left. For years, his life had revolved around work. He had built an empire with his bare hands, turned himself into someone people feared and respected. But at what cost? That night, he sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city, unable to shake her words. It wasn't just what she had said, it was the way she had looked at him when she said it. Like she had seen through every carefully built wall he had put up. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to shake off whatever this was. But the moment he saw her, something in him faltered. She was laughing an easy, genuine laugh while talking to one of the junior employees. It wasn't forced or calculated. It was just natural. And for the first time in a long time, he envied someone else's ability to feel so freely. The tension between them only grew as the days passed. She didn't back down when he pushed, didn't flinch when he tested her patience. If anything, she met him head-on, challenging him in ways no one else ever had. But beneath all of that, something else was brewing. It started small, a lingering glance, the way their conversations stretched longer than necessary, the way he found himself looking for her in a room full of people. He had spent years keeping his distance, believing love was nothing more than a distraction. But now it felt like he was standing at the edge of something he didn't understand. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he wanted to turn back. The distance between them was growing thinner, but so were the boundaries he'd spent years enforcing. She wasn't just someone working for him anymore. She was in his thoughts when she shouldn't be, in the quiet spaces of his mind, where no one else had ever dared to exist. And it was becoming dangerous. He had built his life on control. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate. Yet, when it came to her, there was no strategy, no logic that could explain why she made him feel like the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as it used to be. One evening, after a long day filled with high-stakes negotiations and endless meetings, he stepped into the office lounge, expecting to be alone. Instead, he found her sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights. She didn't turn when he entered, but she knew he was there. "Rough day?" she asked softly. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Every day is rough." She finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it doesn't have to be." There it was again, that quiet, unwavering challenge. She had a way of making him question things he had long accepted as facts. "You don't understand," he said, leaning against the counter. "This world isn't built for softness." She studied him for a moment before speaking. "And what has that gotten you? Power? Money? Fear?" He stiffened at her words, but before he could respond, she stood and walked over to him, closing the space between them in a way that made his pulse quicken. "You keep everyone at a distance," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But that doesn't mean you don't feel." He didn't move. He couldn't. Because she was right. Before he could stop himself, his hand lifted slightly, as if drawn to her without his permission. But just as his fingers barely grazed her arm, his phone buzzed sharply, snapping him back into reality. He took a step back, jaw tightening as he pulled his phone from his pocket. It was a business call, an important one. A reminder of who he was and what he had built. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. But as he entered his office and stared at the city skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a mistake. A few days passed, and he tried to bury himself in work, to pretend that moment hadn't meant anything. But she wasn't avoiding him like he expected. If anything, she was still there, still looking at him with those eyes that made him feel like he was coming undone. And then, just when he thought he had everything under control, something happened that changed everything. A scandal broke out, one that threatened everything he had built. A former associate had come forward with allegations that could ruin his company, his reputation, everything. The media swarmed, investors pulled back, and suddenly, the empire he had spent years fortifying was starting to crack. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. And in the midst of it all, she was still there. She wasn't asking questions or giving him pitying looks. She was standing beside him, steady as ever, as if she had already decided that she wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to do this alone," she said one night, when the weight of it all had nearly crushed him. He wanted to believe her, but he didn't know how. And the closer she got, the more terrified he became. The walls were closing in faster than he could reinforce them. The scandal had already shaken the foundation of his empire, but the real blow came when someone from inside the company leaked confidential documents to the press. It wasn't just a smear campaign anymore, it was an outright attack, and he had no idea who was behind it. He barely slept. Every hour brought a new crisis. Investors were backing out, contracts were being questioned, and his legal team was scrambling to contain the damage. His grip on everything he had built was slipping, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could stop it. She saw it all. The exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he ran his hands through his hair like he was on the edge of unraveling. He wasn't the same man who once stood above the world with unshakable certainty. He was breaking, and she was the only one close enough to see it. Then the second betrayal hit. A trusted executive, someone who had been with the company for years, was named in the leaked documents. At first, it seemed like an accident, but as the evidence piled up, it became clear this wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was personal. Someone inside his own circle had been waiting for the perfect moment to take him down. But that wasn't the worst part. She was implicated too. It made no sense. She had been by his side, fighting for him, believing in him. But now, her name was tangled in the mess, making it look like she had been part of the betrayal all along. The media twisted the story, painting her as the woman who had gotten close to him only to turn against him when it mattered most. He didn't want to believe it. But doubts crept in, poisoning his thoughts. Had he been wrong about her? Had he let his guard down for nothing? She came to him the night the story broke, her face pale, but her voice steady. "You know this isn't true." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to look into her eyes and know, without a doubt, that she hadn't betrayed him. But everything around him was falling apart, and he didn't know who to trust anymore. "I don't know anything anymore," he said, his voice hollow. Her eyes flashed with hurt, but she didn't back down. "You do. You know me." He clenched his jaw, turning away, before she could see how much this was destroying him. If she was innocent, someone had set her up. But if she wasn't, the thought made his chest tighten. Before he could say anything else, his phone buzzed. Another crisis. Another fire to put out. When he turned back around, she was gone. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if she would come back. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. He had spent too long surrounded by deception, and now, everything depended on finding out who was behind it all. The documents, the media storm, the betrayal, it had all been orchestrated, and if he didn't act fast, everything he had built would crumble completely. But there was one thing he knew for certain now: she wasn't behind any of it. After she left that night, something inside him shifted. He replayed every moment they had shared, every conversation, every look. If she had been lying to him all along, he would have seen it. And when he dug deeper into the leaked documents, searching for anything that didn't add up, he found it one tiny inconsistency that changed everything. The executive who had been implicated wasn't working alone. Someone higher up had been pulling the strings, feeding the media just enough information to make it all seem real. And when he traced the source of the leaks, the answer hit him harder than anything he had imagined. It was someone he had trusted with his life. Confronting them wasn't going to be easy, but there was no other choice. The boardroom was empty, except for the two of them. His hands were steady, his voice controlled, but inside he was burning. "I know it was you," he said, laying the evidence on the table between them. "You planned all of this." A slow smile spread across the other man's face. "Took you long enough." Betrayal had a face now, and it was one he had never expected. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Because you had everything," the man said simply. "And I was tired of waiting for you to fail." Rage boiled beneath his skin, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had already alerted his legal team. The damage could be undone, but it would take time. He had lost too much already: his reputation, his stability, and almost the one person who had truly stood by his side. There was only one thing left to do. He walked out without another word, knowing this wasn't over. The fallout would be massive, but now at least he knew where he stood. And the first thing he had to do was find her. He didn't expect her to forgive him, not right away. But when he showed up at her door, the look in her eyes told him she had been waiting. "You know now, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded. "I should have never doubted you." For a moment, there was silence. Then, she stepped aside, letting him in. And just like that, the walls he had spent years building around himself finally began to fall. He stepped inside, the familiar warmth of her presence wrapping around him, but the space between them was still fragile. She folded her arms, watching him carefully, waiting. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that love was a distraction, but now he saw the truth: he had been running from something real. And he almost lost it. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "I was so used to people betraying me that I assumed the worst. I should have trusted you." She exhaled slowly, her eyes searching his face, looking for the sincerity behind his words. "I was hurt," she admitted. "Not just because you didn't believe me, but because for a moment, I wondered if I had misjudged you too." He swallowed hard, knowing that no apology would ever erase what had happened. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I came here because I couldn't let this end like that." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they weren't saying: the hurt, the longing, the unspoken understanding that neither of them had ever felt this way before. Finally, she spoke. "I need time." He nodded. "I'll wait." For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. The fallout from the scandal was far from over. The betrayal had been deeper than he realized, and the legal battles that followed would take months to resolve. But through it all, something had changed. He wasn't the same ruthless businessman he had been before. He started to see things differently. The power and control he once valued above all else seemed meaningless without someone to share it with. She kept her distance at first, focusing on rebuilding her own life. But slowly, things shifted. They talked again, shared quiet moments. And though she was still cautious, he could see it in her eyes. She hadn't stopped feeling the way he did. One evening, after a long day of clearing up the last remnants of the chaos, he found himself outside her door again. This time, he wasn't there to apologize. He was there to tell her the truth, the kind he had been afraid to say for far too long. "I don't just regret what happened," he said the moment she opened the door. "I regret every second I spent pretending I didn't feel this way about you." She blinked, caught off guard, but he continued. "I was scared. I built my entire life around never needing anyone. But you changed that. You changed me." Her expression softened, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. "I don't want to go back to the way things were. I want to build something real with you." She hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You're really bad at this, you know." He let out a short laugh, relief washing over him. "Yeah, but I'm willing to get better." She studied him for a long moment, and then finally, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Then maybe we should start over." He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I'd like that." And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly let someone in.